She made the coffee anyway. That was the thing nobody would understand later when she tried to explain what the first morning felt like. Not the grief counselor she saw twice before stopping. Not her sister-in-law who called once from Phoenix and never again. Not even Bernadette Alcott, who would eventually become the first real friend Dorothea Winslow had made in 4 decades. Nobody quite understood why on the morning after Reginald Winslow was carried out of their bedroom on a gurney, his 70-year-old heart finally done with its work, Dorothea got up at 6:45, ground the beans the way he liked, and carried a full mug up the stairs to the bedroom where he would never again be waiting. She stood in the doorway for a long time. The mug steamed in her hand. The sheets were still pulled back on his side, the pillow still shaped faintly from the weight of his head. The morning light came through the curtains the way it always had, falling across the floor in long, pale rectangles, indifferent to the fact that everything had changed. Dorothea set the mug on his nightstand. She sat on the edge of her side of the bed. She looked at the steam rising and then stopping the coffee going cold, and she thought 40 years. 40 years of this exact motion. The grind, the pour, the walk up the stairs, the presentation of the mug like a small daily sacrament. 40 years of watching his hands wrap around it. 40 years of his voice saying the same thing, "Good morning, Dot," as if those 3 words were enough. As if they had ever been enough. She did not cry that morning. She would wonder about that later. She would wonder if she had simply used up all her tears on things that didn't deserve them. The small humiliations, the quiet exclusions, the 1,000 tiny moments of invisibility that accumulate over 4 decades into something that feels eventually like just the weather, just the way things are, just your life. Reginald Rex Winslow died on a Tuesday in March of 2024. He was 84 years old. He had been one of Boston's most formidable attorneys for more than 50 years, and the city acknowledged his passing the way it acknowledges the passing of men like him, with flowers in law offices, with flags at half-staff outside a courthouse where he had argued 100 cases, with a funeral that filled the Church of the Advent on Brimmer Street to its dark wood rafters. Dorothea was 67 years old. She had been his wife for 40 of those years, and she sat in the second row. She had been placed there by Stafford Rex's oldest son, who had explained it with a smile so practiced it barely reached his jaw. "Space Dot, in case you have family coming." She had no family coming. Her parents had been gone for 15 years. She was an only child. The friends she'd had before the marriage had drifted away so gradually she could not point to the year any of them had gone, only to the slow, uncontested fact of their absence. And Stafford knew all of this. He had known it for 40 years. She sat in the second row and watched the first row fill with Rex's blood. Stafford, 61 years old, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, the physical copy of Rex at that age. Philippa, 58, immaculate in black, her posture the particular posture of women who have spent their lives performing composure. Callum, 56, already scrolling his phone before the organist had finished the opening hymn. Their spouses, their children, Rex's grandchildren who had called Dorothea Rex's wife when they called her anything at all. At the reception afterward, held at Stafford's house in Chestnut Hill, Dorothea stood near the window with a glass of water. She didn't drink and heard Philippa across the room, surrounded by her own friends, her voice carrying with the effortless projection of a woman who has never worried about being overheard. "It's just so hard," Philippa was saying. "Losing Daddy. At least we have each other. The real family." The real family. Dorothea looked at her water glass. She thought about the 40 Christmases she had organized, the 40 Thanksgiving tables she had set, the graduation parties, the birthday dinners, the careful gifts chosen after careful research, because she had never once stopped trying to matter to these people, even when it was clear that mattering was not on offer. The real family. She set her water glass down and found her coat. She had met Rex Winslow in the spring of 1983. She was 26 years old, 3 years out of a state school in Western Massachusetts, with a practical degree she'd chosen because it was practical, working as a secretary at Winslow and Associates, because the pay was good and the firm had a reputation, and because at 26 you take the job that's in front of you and you figure out the rest later. Rex was 43. He had been widowed 2 years earlier when his first wife Eleanor died of an aneurysm at 41. A fact that had rearranged the firm's entire emotional atmosphere into something hushed and careful, the way offices get around a man who is powerful and also suddenly, unexpectedly human. He had 3 children who lived with their aunt during the week and came to him on weekends. He worked until 8 o'clock most nights. He drank his coffee black and could read a deposition faster than anyone Dorothea had ever seen. She was good at her job. That was the foundation of everything. Not her looks, though. She was lovely, in a way she'd never quite believed. Dark hair, pale eyes, the kind of face that photographs younger than it is. Not her ambition, because ambition at that point in her life was something that happened to other people. She was simply excellent at what she did. And Rex noticed excellence, the way a man who has spent his career in argument notices a precise sentence. He asked her to dinner 6 months after she started. She said yes because he was impressive and kind, and because the invitation had surprised her so completely that she had no prepared refusal ready. 6 months after that, he proposed in the garden of a restaurant in the South End. She said yes again, and this time the surprise had been replaced by something that felt very much like joy. Rex was not an easy man to know. He was contained, controlled, a man of careful distances. But in those early months, she had seen something underneath the distance, a weariness, a loneliness, a quality of searching that she understood instinctively because she felt it too. She believed she had found something real. She believed that. They were married in March of 1984, small ceremony at the courthouse, lunch after at a restaurant in the Back Bay. Rex's children attended. Stafford was 20, home from his first year of college, his jaw set in the particular way that would not change in 40 years. Philippa was 18, already expert at the precise smile that communicates contempt without any word being said. Callum was 16 and mostly looked at the floor. At the lunch, while Rex was speaking with the restaurant manager, Philippa leaned across the table toward Dorothea. "You were his secretary," she said. Her voice was pleasant, almost curious. "I just want to make sure you understand that's what you were, before this." Dorothea looked at her. She was 26 years old and she had just married a man she loved, and she did not yet know that this was the opening statement of a 40-year trial she would never quite be allowed to win. "I understand a lot of things," she said carefully. Philippa smiled and leaned back. "I'm sure you do." The years that followed were not unhappy. That was the complicated truth that Dorothea would spend a long time learning how to hold. They were not unhappy years. They were simply not quite hers. The house in Brookline was a federal-style colonial that Rex had owned for 15 years before their marriage. It was beautiful and formal and full of Rex's first life, his first wife's choices in the kitchen, his children's handprints preserved in the wrong places, a quality of established history that Dorothea moved through carefully, like a guest who has been told she is welcome but can feel in every room that this welcome was not offered unanimously. She made it a home anyway. That was what she did. She painted the rooms that needed painting. She planted a garden in the back that had been all grass and became over 20 years one of the most quietly beautiful private gardens in that part of Brookline, rose beds and herb gardens, and perennial borders timed to bloom in sequence from March through November. She hosted dinners that people remembered for years. She learned the names of Rex's colleagues' wives and their children's schools and their preferences in wine, and she used this knowledge with the easy grace of someone for whom social intelligence is a vocation. She remembered every birthday. She attended every graduation. She sent gifts to Rex's grandchildren that were thoughtful in a way that required actual thought, not purchased attention. She cooked thousands of meals in a kitchen that had been designed by a woman she had never met and was decorated with the particular taste of someone whose absence had never fully lifted from the house. In return, she was tolerated. Politely, consistently, without cruelty, except when cruelty was convenient. Stafford called her Rex's wife in situations where Dorothea would have required the same number of syllables. Philippa deployed compliments the way a person deploys a very small weapon with a smile from a distance aimed at something that matters. Callum ignored her with the thoroughness of a man who has decided the easiest path through an uncomfortable situation is to pretend the situation doesn't exist. Rex, for his part, was kind. He provided generously. He never raised his voice. He complimented her cooking and told her the garden was beautiful, and on their anniversary each year without fail, brought her flowers that he'd chosen himself. In the language of men of his generation, in the language of men who had been raised to demonstrate love through provision and consistency rather than expression, this was devotion. But there was a door he never opened. He kept a study on the third floor of the Brookline house, a small room at the end of the hall, and he asked her once early in the marriage to treat it as private. "I need one space that belongs only to me," he said. "Surely you understand that." She understood it. She never tried the handle. She moved through 40 years of marriage with the respectful distance of a woman who trusts completely, who has never been taught to wonder why the man she loves needs a locked room. He kept separate bank accounts. When she'd asked once in 1986 about their finances, he had patted her hand the way a person pats the hand of someone they love, but do not believe requires the full picture. "Don't worry about money, Dot. That's my job. Your job is to make this house a home, and you do it perfectly." She accepted this. She accepted it for the same reason she accepted the second row at the funeral and the Rex's wife, and the missing from every eulogy ever offered about the man she had lived beside for 4 decades. She had been trained not cruelly but thoroughly to understand that her job was support. Her job was presence. Her job was the invisible architecture that holds a life together while someone else takes credit for the building. And then there were the trips. Once a month, sometimes more, Rex would pack a small bag on a Friday afternoon and drive north. "The property," he would say when she asked. "I told you about it, that place I inherited from a distant relative. It needs looking after." He would be back by Sunday evening. She never asked for the address. She never thought to. She packed his bag and kissed him goodbye and trusted him the way you trust someone you have pledged your life to, the way you trust someone when trust has become so habituated that questioning it feels like a betrayal of yourself. Once, maybe 15 years into the marriage, she came into the kitchen to find him standing at the window looking out at her garden with an expression she didn't recognize. Not his controlled public face, and not his careful private face, but something underneath both of those, something unguarded and almost pained. She asked him what he was thinking. He turned and looked at her for a moment without speaking. "I'm building something for you," he said, "something you can't see yet." She assumed he meant the retirement plan, the investment accounts, the future he'd promised in the abstract, that comfortable later that was always just a few years off. She kissed his cheek and went back to whatever she'd been doing, and the moment closed over itself like water over a stone, and she forgot about it almost immediately. She would not forget it again. Rex died on a Tuesday morning in March. Dorothea found him when she brought the coffee. The doctor confirmed it later that day: massive cardiac arrest, instantaneous, no suffering. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a very long time, the mug steaming in her hand, while downstairs the house made its ordinary morning sounds, the refrigerator, cycling, a car passing on the street outside the furnace, breathing in the walls. She called 911. She called Stafford. She sat on the front steps in her robe and watched the ambulance come and go, and she thought distantly that she should feel more than she felt. She thought about 40 years. She thought about the coffee she still made every morning, automatically, the muscle memory of devotion outlasting the man it was devoted to. The funeral was 10 days later. The Church of the Advent was full to its dark rafters with people who had known Rex Winslow at his most public, colleagues, judges, former clients, the kinds of people whose names appear in newspaper announcements of other prominent people's deaths. They filled the pews, and they stood along the back wall, and they spoke when called upon about Rex's legal mind, his integrity in argument, his 5 decades of service to the bar. Not one of them mentioned his marriage. Not one of them acknowledged the woman who had made his home and managed his life and tended his garden for 40 of those 50 years. She sat in the second row and listened to her husband eulogized as a professional and a father and a pillar of the community, and she understood that this was the accounting. This was what 40 years of invisible work produced: perfect invisibility. After the reception, after Philippa's real family, and Callum's phone and Stafford's practiced grief, Dorothea drove home alone. She parked in the driveway of the Brookline house and sat in the car for 20 minutes with the engine off, her hands in her lap, looking at the front door. Then she went inside and began very quietly to prepare. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral on a Thursday morning in April. James Aldrich's office occupied the 14th floor of a building on Congress Street in downtown Boston, with windows that looked out over the harbor. Aldrich had been Rex's estate attorney for more than 2 decades. He was 65, trim, soft-spoken, a man whose fundamental decency expressed itself in small, careful gestures, the way he held the door, the way he ensured every person in a room felt noticed. Dorothea had met him perhaps a dozen times at various professional events over the years, had sat next to him at dinner parties, where he'd asked about her garden with what seemed like genuine interest. She dressed carefully that morning. A simple black dress, her white hair pinned back the way Rex had always preferred. Her hands trembled slightly as she drove downtown. She told herself there was no reason to be afraid. 40 years, a marriage of 40 years. Rex had provided generously their entire lives. Whatever was in that document, she would be taken care of. She told herself this several times during the drive, the way you repeat a thing you know, but can't quite feel. Stafford, Philippa, and Callum arrived together in Stafford's car, trailing two attorneys whose suits communicated their hourly rates. They greeted Dorothea with the careful neutrality of people who have been told to be careful. They arranged themselves on one side of the conference table, united, deliberate, a solid wall of Winslow blood, while Dorothea sat alone on the other side with her hands folded in her lap. James Aldrich began with the formal recitations, the language of legal procedure, the careful architecture of testamentary documents. His voice was measured and neutral in the way of professional men delivering information they would rather not have to deliver. Rex's estate, he explained, was valued at approximately $9.2 million. Dorothea felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. $9.2 million. That was more than enough. That was a life. That was security. Whatever her portion, it would be sufficient. James continued. The Brookline property, currently valued at $2.3 million, was left in its entirety to Stafford Philippa and Callum Winslow to be divided equally or sold with proceeds distributed three ways as they determined appropriate. The tension returned. Investment accounts totaling approximately $5.1 million. Same distribution. The cold was spreading through her chest, now making the room feel very small. Retirement accounts $1.8 million. Same. James? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. What did Rex leave for me? James Aldrich looked at her. In 20 years of attending dinner parties where this man had asked about her roses, she had never seen his face look like this. She had never seen his hands move with that particular careful quality, as though he were handling something that might break. I'm getting to your specific bequest now, Dorothea. I want you to know that He stopped, looked at the document in front of him, looked at her. I argued against the language. Rex insisted. I'm very sorry. He read from the document. Rex had written and James read verbatim as required that Dorothea had lived comfortably at his expense for 40 years and had wanted for nothing during the course of their marriage. That she had benefited from his wealth, his home, his social standing, and a lifestyle far beyond what she could have achieved on her own working as a secretary. That this constituted more than adequate compensation for her companionship in the domestic services she had provided. Each word landed like a step on ice, solid for a moment, then giving way beneath the weight. Companionship, domestic services. 40 years reduced to the language of a service contract, 40 years of love and loyalty, and all those mornings with the coffee, and all those evenings with the dinner, and all those days in the garden, reduced in Rex Winslow's final legal document to adequately compensated domestic services. Across the table, Stafford had settled back in his chair with the particular ease of a man whose expectations have been confirmed. Philippa was studying her nails. Callum had his phone out. James read the rest. Rex's primary obligation, the document stated, was to his children and his bloodline. They were his true legacy. And therefore to Dorothea he left the following one property located at 12 Maplewood Drive, Clearwater Falls, Vermont, along with all contents contained therein, with the express understanding that she would vacate the Brookline residence within 30 days. The room was silent except for the sound of Callum's phone. Philippa broke it, her voice taking on the particular texture of performed sympathy that Dorothea had spent 40 years learning to identify. Daddy mentioned that property once. He said it was just an old house falling apart out in the middle of nowhere. At least you'll have a roof over your head. Stafford was already somewhere else in his mind. We'll need to discuss the timeline for vacating. We're planning to list immediately. The market in that neighborhood is extremely strong. James Aldrich slid the brown envelope across the table with a hand that was not quite steady. Inside was a deed, a rusty iron key, and a folded sheet of paper. Dorothea did not read the paper in the room. She picked up the envelope. She stood. She walked to the door without speaking to any of them. Not to Stafford, who was already talking to one of his attorneys, Not to Philippa, who was watching her go with the expression of a woman who has gotten what she wanted, not to Callum, who did not look up from his phone. James said her name as she reached the door. She turned. "If you need anything," he said, "anything at all, please call me." She nodded. She walked out. She made it to the parking garage, to her car before she unfolded the paper. Rex's handwriting, the controlled, precise script she had watched sign documents and birthday cards and checks for 40 years. Dot. This is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. You'll understand everything once you arrive. I couldn't tell you before. They were always watching, always looking for ways to challenge anything I tried to do. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love, always. Rex. Trust me one last time, after what had just happened in that room. After those words. After domestic services inadequately compensated. She sat in her car in the parking garage with her hands on the wheel and the envelope in her lap and the rusty iron key pressing its shape into her palm, and she cried for a long time. Not the gentle tears of grief, but the deep, ragged, humiliating kind that come when something you have believed in for 40 years turns out to be built on something you don't recognize. She cried until she was empty. Then she drove back to Brookline, parked in the driveway one more time, and went inside to begin packing. The 30 days that followed were an education in a particular kind of cruelty, the kind that is delivered with perfect plausible deniability, the kind that has been refined over decades by people who have never had to examine whether they are decent human beings. Stafford arrived the morning after the will reading with 2 contractors and a measuring tape. He did not ask Dorothea to leave the kitchen while they moved through it discussing which walls to open. He simply moved through the kitchen as though she were furniture. Philippa arrived 2 days later with an interior designer, a woman in her 40s, who spoke in the clipped vocabulary of someone billing by the hour. They stood in the living room, stood within feet of where Dorothea sat reading and discussed staging strategies and furniture placement and the need to remove what the designer called accumulated personal effects before listing. The garden visible through the French doors was described as significantly overgrown and in need of professional remediation before any showing. That garden, 20 years of her hands in that soil, 20 years of tending and planning and learning the specific requirements of each plant the way you learn the specific requirements of the people you love. Overgrown, in need of remediation. Callum came once, walked through several rooms with a realtor, and left without acknowledging Dorothea's presence at all. Not an insult, not a word, simply nothing. The practiced nothing of a man who has been treating a person as invisible for so long that the invisibility has become sincere. The nights were the hardest. Dorothea would lie in the master bedroom. Stafford had allowed her to stay there since, as he'd explained, the furniture needed to remain in place for staging purposes, and her mind would work through the numbers with the terrible thoroughness of fear. She was 67 years old. The last time she had worked, the last time she had drawn a paycheck for anything outside this house was 1984. 40 years ago, she had no savings of her own, no accounts in her name. Rex had managed the finances. Rex had always managed the finances. The Vermont property. What would it be worth? An old house falling apart in a small town nobody had heard of. $50,000 if she was fortunate. 60 perhaps. That might cover 4 years of modest living. And then what, 71 years old with no work history and no prospects and no family dependent on whatever the state offered to women who had spent their lives building something that turned out to belong entirely to someone else. On the 22nd night, lying in the dark with the fear pressing down on her chest like a physical weight, she heard voices from the dining room. Stafford and Philippa talking without concern about being heard or past caring. "I honestly still can't believe he left her anything at all," Philippa was saying. 4 decades is a long time to string someone along," Stafford replied, "even if she was essentially just the help. The Vermont place is his guilty conscience in deed form. She should be grateful she's not filing for emergency housing assistance." Philippa laughed, not a cruel laugh exactly, the laugh of someone who has never needed to imagine a fear in order to feel it. Dorothea lay in the dark and held the edge of her blanket with both hands and did not make a sound. 40 years of practice. 40 years of swallowing it down and smoothing it over and choosing the grace of silence over the satisfaction of being heard. The conditioning held even now, even here, even after everything. On the morning of the 30th day, she rose at 6 and walked through the house one final time. The kitchen, the dining room. The formal living room with the fireplace she had never been able to make feel warm no matter how many fires she built in it. The library that had Rex's books in it and none of her own. Upstairs, the bedroom she had kept ready for children who visited as infrequently as possible and left as quickly as they came. The only place she lingered was the garden. She went out in the early morning chill and stood among the roses she had planted in 1985, their first spring in the house when she was 27, and hopeful and had believed that beauty was a kind of argument. She touched the bark of the climbing rose on the back fence. She looked at the herb beds, the perennials, the bulbs she'd planted every fall for 20 years, calculating the sequence of bloom so that something was always flowering from March through November. These would belong to strangers, strangers who would not know what they had, who would not know the name of a single plant the year it was planted. The woman who learned its preferences, the way you learn the preferences of someone you love. She went inside. She finished packing. 3 suitcases, 2 boxes, 40 years and 5 containers. The wedding photograph from the mantelpiece, which Stafford had started to object to before apparently deciding it wasn't worth the argument. Her mother's letters, her grandmother's books, a few photographs of the garden in its best seasons. Stafford arrived at 1:30 punctual in the way of people who want something done. Dorothea was ready. She carried the last box to the car herself, declined Stafford's offer to call someone to help, and stood for a moment by the driver's door. Stafford, her voice was quiet. He looked at her with the expression of a man waiting for something he intends to deflect. Do you know what 40 years cost not in dollars, in a person's entire life? He flushed, his jaw tightened. Father left you a property, Dot. You're not getting nothing. He left me a mystery, she said, and you received an empire. I hope you understand the difference eventually. She got in the car before he could respond. The brown envelope was on the passenger seat, the rusty key inside it pressing its shape through the paper. She entered the address into the GPS. Clearwater Falls, Vermont. 3 hours and 22 minutes. She started the engine. She pulled out of the driveway of the house where she had lived for 40 years. She did not look in the rearview mirror. As she drove north out of Boston through the suburbs and into the countryside through the bare, early spring trees that lined the highway in both directions like witnesses to something, Dorothea Winslow made herself a single promise. Whatever waited at 12 Maplewood Drive, whether it was shelter or ruined value or worthlessness, an ending or a beginning, she would face it with everything she had left. She was 67 years old. She had 3 suitcases, 2 boxes of wedding photograph, and a rusty key. She had spent 40 years being invisible. She was done with that now. The GPS lost the signal twice on the way into Clearwater Falls. The first time was somewhere outside of Montpelier, where the highway narrowed and the hills rose on both sides, and the cell towers apparently gave up trying. The second time was on the county road that led north from the interstate, a 2-lane stretch of cracked asphalt that wound through maple forests still bare from winter, the trees standing in the gray afternoon light, like tall patient things that had been waiting there long before roads existed and would be waiting long after. Dorothea drove without the GPS for 20 minutes following the handwritten directions James Aldrich had included in the envelope below Rex's note, left at the junction with the grain silo, right at the white church. Through the covered bridge, then follow Maplewood Road until the pavement ends. Continue on the dirt track for approximately 1 mile. She had not spoken aloud since leaving Boston. 3.5 hours of silence, which was not unusual for her. She had learned long ago to be comfortable in her own quiet, but which felt different today, weighted with something that was not yet grief and not yet hope, but existed somewhere between them in the uncertain territory of not knowing. She found the grain silo. She found the white church smaller than she expected, its steeple modest against the sky. She found the covered bridge, the boards rattling under her tires as she crossed it. On the other side, the pavement ended exactly as promised, and the road became a dirt track lined on both sides by sugar maples, whose bare branches wove overhead into something that was almost a roof. She drove slowly, her low-clearance sedan, navigating the ruts and packed mud of early spring. The forest was dense and still on either side. The afternoon was beginning to gray toward evening. She was 67 years old, and she was driving into a wood in Vermont to look at a property she had never seen in a town she had never heard of, on the basis of a note from a man who had just publicly declared her adequate compensation for domestic services rendered. Trust me one last time. The GPS reconnected with a small chime and announced in its pleasant mechanical voice that she had arrived at her destination. Dorothea stopped the car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking straight ahead at the dashboard. She had been preparing herself for this in the back of her mind for the entire drive. She had been constructing a reasonable framework for disappointment. An old house, Philippa had said, falling apart, middle of nowhere, not worth the hassle of selling. She had run the numbers again in her head, the possible sale prices, the years that money might cover. She had made herself ready for ruin. She looked up. The property sat in a large clearing, held on all sides by the old maples like a cupped hand. The house was built of gray fieldstone granite she would later learn quarried locally sometime in the 1870s, 2 stories with a steep slate roof that appeared from where she sat to be entirely intact. White-painted wooden trim framed windows of leaded glass. A heavy oak door stood under a small, covered portico, with carved supports, the wood darkened by decades of Vermont weather, but solid, unmistakably solid. Ivy grew up the east wall in a way that looked considered architectural, like something on the grounds of a college in a New England painting. The gardens surrounding the house were overgrown, that was true. But even through the tangle of unpruned roses and the grass that had claimed the stone pathways, Dorothea could see the bones of something that had once been deliberate and was still beneath its wildness beautiful. She could see the original design the way you can see the structure of a face in an old photograph. Stone paths leading somewhere, organized beds that had given themselves over to riot, a fountain dry and mossy standing in what had clearly been a formal garden area, at some point still elegant, even in disuse, the stone bowl weathered to the color of the house itself. She sat in the car and looked at all of it for a long time. This was not ruin. This was not the derelict nobody wanted, the guilty afterthought of a man distributing an empire. Whatever this was, it was something else entirely. She heard footsteps on the dirt road behind her. She looked in the rearview mirror. A woman was walking toward her car with the purposeful stride of someone who has somewhere specific to be a woman in her early 70s, sturdy and upright, wearing a canvas jacket and carrying a wicker basket covered with a blue cloth. Her gray hair was cut short and practical. Her face, when she reached the driver's side window, was open and direct and entirely without the performance of strangers who have never met. Dorothea rolled down the window. "You must be Dot," the woman said. Not a question. She said it the way you say the name of someone you have been expecting. "I'm Bernadette Alcott. Everyone calls me Bernie. I run the general store on Main Street." She held up the basket. Bread, eggs, buttermilk, cheese, coffee, and a jar of last September's apple butter, which is better than anything you'll find in a grocery store, and I say that without any humility whatsoever. The house has been maintained, but there's no food stocked. I figured you'd need something for tonight. Dorothea looked at her. "How did you know I was coming?" "Rex told us to watch for a woman named Dot driving an older Honda," Bernie said simply. "He said you'd come eventually after he was gone. He said you might arrive looking like the world had just ended." She paused, studying Dorothea's face with the frank assessment of a woman who has no patience for social filters. He was right about that part. "Come on, I'll help you get the door open." Dorothea got out of the car on legs that were not entirely steady. The key turned in the lock on the first try. She had expected resistance. The lock looked old, the key looked older, and rust generally means friction. But the mechanism moved as though it had been oiled recently, as though someone had anticipated this exact moment and prepared for it, which she was beginning to understand was precisely what had happened. The heavy oak door swung open without sound onto the interior of the house, and Dorothea stepped across the threshold and stopped. The main floor was open, the proportions generous without being grandiose. Wide plank wood floors, pine-old growth, with a warm amber patina of a century and a half of use extended through the entire space. A stone fireplace dominated the north wall, its mantel carved from a single piece of oak, the firebox large enough that she could have stood in it. The furniture was simple, a sofa, in worn leather the color of saddle, 2 armchairs positioned toward the windows, a long oak table against the east wall. Built-in shelves flanked the fireplace, filled with books, leather-bound, cloth-bound, paperback, hardcover, the shelves of a person who actually reads rather than the shelves of a person who wants to appear to. The light came through the leaded glass windows in patterns that moved across the floor as the late afternoon clouds shifted outside. And then she saw the photographs. They covered every available surface. They hung on every wall. They stood on shelves between the books, on the mantel, on the side table beside the sofa, on the windowsills. Dozens of them, perhaps more. She would count them later and lose count somewhere past 60. Photographs of Dorothea. She moved closer to the nearest one hanging on the wall beside the fireplace. It was her on their wedding day in 1984, 26 years old, in the simple cream dress she had chosen because she hadn't wanted to spend money on something elaborate. She was laughing. She couldn't remember now what she had been laughing at, but whoever had taken the photograph, Rex, she understood immediately Rex had taken it, had caught a moment of complete, unperformed joy. The next one, Dorothea, in the Brookline garden, perhaps 10 years into the marriage. Kneeling in the soil of the herb bed, her hands dark with earth, her face turned slightly toward the camera in a way that suggested she had half noticed the lens, but not quite adjusted to it. She looked in that photograph more like herself than she had felt in years. Another Dorothea, reading in a chair by a window she didn't recognize, afternoon light catching the silver that had begun to come into her hair. She had not known this photograph was being taken. Another Dorothea asleep on a porch. A wooden porch she had never seen before, with the line of maple trees visible at the edge of the frame. She turned and looked at the porch through the window to her right. The same porch, the same tree line. Rex had photographed her sleeping here on this porch in this house, which meant he had brought her here somehow at some point without her knowing, or the photograph was impossible, and yet it existed, her own face in repose against a background she was standing in for the first time. She pressed her hand flat against the glass. "He loved you very much." Bernie's voice came from behind her, quiet and certain. Anyone who walked into this room understood that within about 30 seconds. "He built this place around you. Every photograph, chosen, framed, placed. He called it the sanctuary. He said it was the only room he knew of where he could remember exactly who he was." Dorothea could not speak. She stood with her hand against the window and looked at the photographs of herself, 40 years of her life, captured and cherished and displayed in a room she had never entered by a man who had never found the language to tell her this was what he was doing. The tears came without warning, the way the important ones always do. Not the controlled grief of the funeral, not the humiliated tears in the parking garage after the will reading. Something older than those. Something that had been waiting a very long time for this specific unlocking. Bernie let her cry. She stood in the doorway with the basket in her hands, and she waited without comment or interference, with the patience of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that some things require their full passage. When it was done, Dorothea wiped her face with the back of her hand and straightened her shoulders and turned around. "Show me the rest," she said. The kitchen was at the back of the house, a long room with north and south windows that would fill it with light in both morning and afternoon. An antique cast-iron wood stove sat against one wall, functional, Bernie explained, and cleaned and inspected annually alongside a modern gas range, and a refrigerator that hummed quietly and had apparently been running for 40 years on the same maintenance fund that covered everything else. Copper pots hung from a rack above the central island. Open shelving held dishes that were beautiful in a plain, considered way, the kind of dishes chosen by someone who eats at home and wants the table to mean something. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms. The largest faced east over the garden, with a fireplace and windows that looked out at the maple line, and more photographs of Dorothea on the walls, these more intimate, more private. Her in the morning before she had arranged herself for the day. Her in winter, bundled into the coat she'd worn for 15 years before Rex finally persuaded her to replace it. Her at some angle she didn't recognize herself, in some angle Rex had found that she had never seen in a mirror. The smallest bedroom had been made into a reading room, 3 walls of shelves, a single chair, a lamp positioned exactly right. The books were hers, or rather, they were the books she would have chosen, the writer she loved, the subjects she had spent 40 years reading around the edges of when she had time and silence enough. She pulled one from the shelf and opened it. Inside the front cover, Rex's handwriting for Dot. Clearwater Falls, Vermont, September 2007. He had been curating this library for decades, adding to it year by year during his monthly drives north, building a library for a woman who would not know it existed until she needed it. She held the book for a long time. Back downstairs, Bernie had unpacked the basket onto the kitchen counter and put the kettle on. They sat at the kitchen table while the evening came on outside, and Bernie told her things about Rex in this town that undid quietly and completely the version of him that she had been given 40 years to believe. Pastor Ellsworth at the small congregational church on Main Street. Rex had attended services there whenever he came to Clearwater Falls, sitting in the third pew from the back, and after the service, he would ask the pastor to say a prayer for his wife. Not for himself, not for his children, not for his legal cases or his professional legacy. For his wife. Every month for 40 years, a prayer for Dot. Mrs. Hargrove, 80 years old, who lived in the farmhouse at the edge of town, her grandson had received a full scholarship to the University of Vermont. In 2009, anonymous source, no application required. The scholarship was named in the legal documents that accompanied it the Dorothea Winslow Educational Fund for Dot's future neighbors. Winifred Oakes, 34 years old. The town librarian everyone called Freddie when the town had lost its library funding. In 2015, Rex had appeared one morning with a bank draft that covered 5,000 books, a new roof, and 3 years of operating costs. His stated reason, recorded in the gift letter, was that his wife loved books, and any town she might one day live in deserved a library worthy of her. Dorothea sat at the kitchen table and listened to these things and felt something happening to her, understanding of her own life. Not a shattering exactly, but a slow, thorough rearrangement, like furniture being moved in a dark room, to reveal that the room was larger than she had believed. Rex had loved her. Not in the language she had sometimes wished for, not in the public declarations, or the standing up to his children, or the simple acknowledgement in any of 1,000 possible moments that she mattered as much as she believed she did. Not in any of those ways, but in this way, in the specific private 40-year construction of a place that existed entirely for her, in the prayers offered on her behalf in a church she had never entered, in the scholarships named for her future, in the library built against the day she might need one. He had loved her in secret. He had loved her completely. And he had arranged with the careful legal mind of a man who had spent 50 years outthinking opposition for that love to survive him in a form that no one could contest or diminish or reduce to domestic services adequately compensated. She was still working out how to hold both things at once, the grief of the inadequacy and the astonishment of the love, when she noticed the door. It was beneath the staircase, set into the wall at the angle of the risers, small enough that you would miss it easily if you weren't looking. A plain wood door with a simple iron latch. No lock. She found it in the late evening after Bernie had gone home with a promise to return in the morning, when Dorothea was moving slowly through the house with a cup of tea, learning the geography of it, pressing her hand against walls and running her fingers along windowsills, the way you do in a place you are trying to memorize. She pressed the latch and the door swung inward. The room was perhaps 10 feet by 12. No windows. 3 walls lined floor to ceiling with built-in shelves, each shelf bearing folders and binders and document boxes labeled in Rex's handwriting, the same controlled, precise script she had spent 40 years watching move across legal pads and birthday cards and the checks he wrote for things he believed in. The 4th wall held a mahogany desk, a leather chair worn to the shape of the person who had sat in it hundreds of times, and a green-shaded banker's lamp that cast its particular quality of focused light over everything it touched. In the center of the desk, positioned with unmistakable intent, was a thick cream envelope. On its face in Rex's handwriting, "To my beloved Dot." She sat in the leather chair, Rex's chair, shaped by 40 years of his thought, and she opened the envelope with hands that had stopped trembling, somewhere between the covered bridge in this room, and she read. The letter was 5 pages written on the heavy cream stationery Rex had used for important correspondence, their entire marriage. She read it slowly, the way you read something you know will change you, giving each sentence its full weight before moving to the next. He began with an apology, not the performed apologies of their marriage, the quick contritions over small failures. This was the apology of a man who has done his accounting and found himself genuinely short. He apologized for his cowardice, for his silences, for 40 years of loving her privately while allowing his children to treat her as a subordinate in her own home. For the will, for the language of the will, for the words domestic services, for the public reduction of everything she had been to something the law could categorize and dismiss. Then he explained. The language of the will had been deliberate. Stafford Philippa and Callum had been watching his estate planning for 2 decades, alert for any asset directed toward Dorothea that they might challenge in probate. Rex had seen it clearly from the legal side what they would do. He had given them in the public document exactly what they wanted. The visible wealth, the headline numbers, and he had given them that wealth in a form designed to frustrate them, tied up in trusts with conditions they could not satisfy, and a house encumbered with obligations that would cost them more than the asset was worth. He had not punished them. He had simply arranged reality so that their greed would punish itself. And he had protected Dorothea in the only way that would hold. The Clearwater Falls property had been deeded to her in June of 1984, 3 months after their wedding, when his distant relative Cornelius Winslow had died and left the house to Rex with a note that read in its entirety, "Protect this place for someone you love more than life itself. It deserves to shelter love, not ambition." Rex had driven to Vermont that same week, looked at the house, and driven to an attorney's office and signed it over to Dorothea's name, not as a marital asset, as an outright gift prior to any commingling of finances structured under a legal framework that Stafford's attorneys would find airtight. He had been building it for her since before she had any reason to need it. The property itself, the letter continued, sat on 230 acres of protected woodland in Grafton County. It had been assessed the previous year at approximately $3.4 million, with conservation organizations that had already made inquiries. The house alone, as a historic structure, was valued at approximately $900,000. And beyond the values, the trust fund Rex had established covered all property expenses, utilities, taxes, insurance, maintenance for the next 50 years. She would never have to worry about the costs of this place, never have to fear losing it to something as ordinary as money. Finally, he explained the filing cabinets. 50 years of practicing law in Boston had generated inevitably documentation. The kinds of things that powerful people generated and then tried to ensure remained private. Rex had never used any of it. Using it would have been wrong. But he had kept it organized and current because information is the only insurance that compounds without risk. If Stafford or Philippa or Callum ever attempted to challenge her, to diminish her, to take from her what he had left her, she had the means to end that conversation before it truly began. The folder in the third cabinet labeled with their names contained documentation sufficient to produce consequences none of them would find acceptable. Use it only if necessary, but know it is there. The letter ended simply. "You were the best part of my life, the only fully real thing in a life that required most of the time a great deal of performance. I failed you in the ways that would have cost me something to fix, and I am deeply sorry for that. I hope I have succeeded in the way that mattered most in making sure that when I was no longer there to stand between you and the world, you could stand there yourself. The sanctuary is yours. It was always yours. I built it for you before I had the sense to know that you were the kind of woman who builds things herself. Forgive me for my cowardice. Remember that I loved you every day. Your Rex." Dorothea sat in his chair for a long time. Then she laughed. It surprised her, the laugh rising out of something she hadn't expected to find in that room, a wild, sudden appreciation for the precise, patient brilliance of what he had done. The empire he had given his children, that would cost them everything. The ruin he had given her, that was worth more than any of it. The 40-year construction of a gift delivered at the exact moment she needed it most. She laughed until tears came again. These different from all the others, and eventually both the laughing and the crying subsided, and she sat quietly in the leather chair and looked at the room around her. She opened the first filing cabinet. The property documentation was exactly as Rex had described. Deed dated June 1984. Dorothea Claire Winslow, sole owner. No encumbrances, no mortgages, no conditions. The trust fund paperwork. The conservation organization correspondence. The property assessment. All of it organized with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 50 years preparing cases that could not be argued away. She opened the second cabinet. The trust fund structures for Stafford, Philippa, and Callum were more complex than she could fully parse in one reading, but the architecture was clear enough. Stafford's $5 million accessible only in increments of $100,000 annually, conditional on continuous verifiable employment and an annual character evaluation administered by the Honorable Raymond Whitfield, a federal judge retired whose reputation for ethical rigor had apparently been the reason Rex had chosen him, and whose opinion of Stafford Rex had apparently not considered favorable. Philippa's trust included the stable family relationships condition, 3 divorces, 2 estranged adult children, no mechanism in the legal world to satisfy what the document required of her. Callum's inheritance locked inside a business investment trust demanding his direct hands-on management, a requirement that would dissolve to charity within 12 months of his first failure to file the required quarterly reports. And the Brookline house. She found the mortgage documentation from 2022, a substantial loan taken out quietly against the property, the proceeds directed into Rex's personal accounts, and from there into trusts and funds she was only now discovering. And attached to the mortgage record, a copy of the historic preservation easement Rex had inserted into the property deed in 2019, a document committing any future owner to a review process of extraordinary complexity for any renovation, sale, or structural change routed through a preservation committee that met twice annually and was known in Boston real estate circles for its slow and meticulous deliberations. He had given them chains that looked like gold. He had done it over years methodically with the patience of a man who knows exactly how a trap works because he has spent his career watching other men build them badly. She closed the second cabinet. She sat for a long moment looking at the third. Then she opened it. The folders labeled with her stepchildren's names were thick. She did not read them. She looked at their weight in her hands and put them back in the drawer and closed it. She would not read them unless she had no other choice. Rex had been right about that. Using them would be wrong. But knowing they existed was its own kind of steadiness, the way knowing the ground is solid under your feet allows you to walk across it without looking down. She turned off the banker's lamp and went upstairs to the room with the fireplace, and the photographs of herself she had never known were being taken, and she lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the Vermont night outside the windows, quieter than anything she had heard in 40 years of living inside the machinery of a Boston life. And she felt for the first time since Rex had died, something she almost recognized as peace. The first 2 weeks in Clearwater Falls moved in a rhythm she had not anticipated. Bernie arrived each morning with something from the store or her kitchen, and she stayed for coffee, and through her, Dorothea met the town. Pastor Ellsworth, a kind man in his 60s, who had been listening to Rex pray for her once a month for decades, shook her hand on the steps of the Congregational Church on her first Sunday and said simply that he was glad she had finally come. Mrs. Hargrove brought apple cake and told her about her grandson's scholarship, and when Dorothea confirmed that yes, she was the Dorothea of the Dorothea Winslow Educational Fund, the old woman pressed her hand between both of hers and held it for a long moment without speaking. Freddie Oakes showed her around the library on a Tuesday afternoon, pulling book after book from the shelves to show her what Rex had chosen, the range and quality of the collection a small town had no business owning. In the mornings when the light was good, Dorothea began working in the garden. She started with the rose beds nearest the house, cutting back the canes that had gone wild over years of benign neglect. Finding beneath the overgrowth the original structure of plantings that someone, Cornelius presumably, or the people who had tended the property during Rex's stewardship, had put in with genuine knowledge. Good varieties well chosen. She cleared the stone path that led from the house to the dry fountain and found the stones intact beneath the grass that had swallowed them. She sat on the edge of the fountain basin in the afternoon sun and looked at the house from the garden's perspective. She had not sat still in a garden she owned since Brookline, since the house that was no longer hers. But this was hers. It had been hers since June of 1984. It had been waiting for her for 40 years, maintained and held and prepared by a man who had loved her quietly and imperfectly, and with a thoroughness that she was still 2 weeks in learning the full shape of. She was in the garden on a Tuesday morning when her phone rang. James Aldrich. She answered it and pressed it to her ear and listened. Dot. His voice was careful in the way of a man delivering news he wishes he could improve. I hope you're settling in. I wanted to warn you before you heard it from another direction. Stafford has retained counsel. They've filed an initial motion arguing that the Clearwater Falls property should be classified as a marital asset subject to equitable distribution. They want a court to order a forced sale and divide the proceeds 4 ways. She was quiet for a moment. The garden was still around her. The maple trees at the edge of the clearing stood in the early June light, patient and enormous. James, she said, how airtight is the 1984 deed structure? Completely, he said. Rex had me review it twice in the last 5 years. There is no credible legal argument that property gifted outright before marital commingling constitutes a marital asset. But Stafford's attorneys are expensive, and they are not interested in what's credible. They're interested in what's costly to defend. I understand, she said. This could take years, Dot, and the legal fees alone, James of Aces. She looked at the house, its fieldstone face, the carved portico, the leaded glass catching the morning light. I'm not going to need years. A pause. What do you mean? She thought about the third filing cabinet. She thought about the folder in the third filing cabinet that she had not opened and would not open unless she had no other choice. She thought about Rex's voice in his letter, know that it is there. I mean, Rex prepared for this too, she said. Give me a little time, let them come. She put the phone in her pocket and turned back to the roses. The canes needed cutting. The stone paths needed clearing. The fountain needed water in it, and the garden needed time. And she had, for the first time in 40 years, exactly as much time as she needed, and no one to account to for how she spent it. She picked up her shears. She got back to work. The motion arrived by certified mail on a Thursday morning in late June. Dorothea was in the garden when the postal carrier came up the dirt road in his truck, and she signed for the envelope with soil on her hands and carried it inside and set it on Rex's desk without opening it. She made coffee first. She sat in Rex's leather chair with the mug warming both hands and looked at the envelope for a while before she picked it up. The legal language inside was dense and deliberate, the kind of prose designed to make the person reading it feel that the situation is more complicated than it is, that the ground is less stable than it appeared. Stafford's attorneys had filed in Suffolk County arguing that the Clearwater Falls property, regardless of how it had been titled in 1984, represented a significant marital asset that Dorothea had benefited from throughout the marriage, and that equity demanded its inclusion in the estate's equitable distribution. They used the word equity 4 times in 3 pages, which was the kind of thing Rex would have noted with a certain dry appreciation. She read it twice. Then she called James Aldrich. I've seen it, he said before she could speak. I was going to call you this morning. They've chosen their venue carefully. Suffolk County has a judge who has made some expansive rulings on marital property in the last few years. It's not a frivolous choice. It's meant to make us nervous. Are you nervous? She asked. A pause. I'm cautious. There's a difference. What do we need to do first? We file a response. I'll draft it today. The 1984 documentation is unambiguous, and I'll make sure the response reflects that. But I want you to understand what they're attempting. They're not expecting to win this argument. They're expecting to make the argument expensive enough that you'll settle rather than fight it. She looked out the window at the garden. The roses she had cut back were already responding, sending up new growth in the particular urgent way of things that had been waiting for attention. The stone path to the fountain was clearer now. The flags leveled, the moss between them trimmed. The fountain itself had been cleaned 2 weeks ago, and she had found the valve in the cellar that controlled its water supply, and now it ran quietly, steadily, the sound carrying through the open window. File the response, she said, and James schedule the first hearing as soon as the calendar allows. I'd like this resolved quickly. Quickly may not be. I know, she said. File it anyway. The hearing was set for mid-July, 3 weeks later, in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the courthouse on Pemberton Square. Dorothea drove down to Boston the day before and stayed in a hotel near the Common, a modest place she had chosen herself with her own money from the account James had helped her open in her name alone. She ate dinner alone at a restaurant she had walked past 100 times during her marriage without entering, and she ordered what she wanted without consulting anyone, and she sat by the window and watched the evening city move outside the glass and felt underneath the anxiety of the next morning something that was not entirely unpleasant, a quality of self-possession, a sense of occupying her own life from the inside rather than observing it from a respectful distance. In the morning, she dressed carefully in a dark blue suit she had bought in Montpelier the week before. Not black. She had worn enough black. The courtroom was smaller than she expected. Wood-paneled and fluorescent lit, a room designed for the administrative processing of disputes rather than the dramatic resolution of them. Stafford's legal team occupied one side of the room, 3 attorneys arranged around their client, their suits communicating their billing rates in the same language. Suits always communicate such things. Stafford himself sat at the center, silver-haired, composed, wearing the expression of a man who expects to prevail. Philippa was in the gallery behind him. She had not been invited, James said quietly when Dorothea sat down beside him. She had come anyway. James presented their response with the economy of a man who has spent 40 years arguing in rooms like this one. The 1984 deed, the outright gift structure, the legal framework Rex had established with the specific intention of separating the property from any future marital estate. He cited 3 precedents. He was done in 11 minutes. Stafford's lead attorney, a man named Garrett, who moved through a courtroom with the practiced ease of someone who charges $450 an hour for that ease, argued for 22. His argument was creative. Dorothea granted him that. It involved concepts of beneficial use, implied tenancy, and equitable enrichment. The suggestion that because Dorothea had been the beneficiary of Rex's wealth throughout their marriage, any asset that had been maintained and improved during that marriage was functionally a marital asset, regardless of how it had been legally titled. The judge, a woman in her 60s, with the expression of someone who has heard every version of every argument and is no longer surprised by any of them, listened without visible reaction and then set a continuation date 6 weeks out, citing the need to review documentation. Outside the courtroom in the marble corridor, Stafford fell into step beside Dorothea before James could position himself between them. "Just settle, Dot." His voice was low and conversational, the voice of a man who believes he is being reasonable. "Take whatever we offer and disappear quietly. This doesn't have to be ugly." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him fully directly, in a way she understood she had been carefully not doing for 40 years, the way you don't look directly at something when you've decided it's safer not to see it clearly. Stafford Winslow was 61 years old. He had his father's bone structure and his father's commanding height, and none of his father's precision. He was wearing a suit that cost more than some people's monthly income, and he was looking at her with the patient, slightly pitying expression of a man who has never once in his life needed to imagine what it costs to be afraid. "My name," she said, "is Mrs. Winslow, and I have never disappeared quietly in my life. I simply let you believe I had." She walked past him toward the elevator. James caught up with her at the button, and they rode down in silence. And it was only in the lobby, moving through the revolving door into the July heat of Pemberton Square, that James said quietly, "Well?" "Well," she agreed. She drove back to Clearwater Falls that afternoon. She was in the garden the following morning when Bernie arrived with bread, in the particular expression Bernie wore when she was carrying news. It was an expression Dorothea had come to recognize in 6 weeks, a heightening of attention around the eyes, a quality of contained information. "Stafford's car was spotted in town last night," Bernie said, "filling up at the gas station on Route 9. He had 2 people with him, nobody from here." Dorothea straightened up from the rose bed and pulled off her gloves. When, around 8, Hester at the gas station said he asked for directions to Maplewood Road. She gave him wrong ones. Bernie paused. Not intentionally, she just doesn't know Maplewood Road very well. He would have figured it out eventually. Dorothea looked at the house. In 6 weeks, she had learned its face the way you learn the face of someone you live with, the way the morning light moved across the fieldstone, the particular quality of the east windows at noon, the sound the oak door made when the weather was dry versus when it was damp. She knew this house now. It knew her. "Let them come," she said. They came on a Saturday morning in the last week of July. Dorothea heard the car before she saw it, the sound of a vehicle moving slowly up the dirt track. The engine too smooth for the road, the kind of car that belongs on pavement and knows it. She was upstairs when it appeared in the clearing, a dark Cadillac that caught the morning sun on its hood and looked on the dirt road among the maples like something that had taken a very wrong turn. Stafford got out first, then Philippa in city clothes that would be ruined by the end of the drive back. Then Callum, who looked around at the clearing with the expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he understood. Dorothea watched from the upstairs window as all 3 of them stood in the clearing and looked at the house. She had wondered what their faces would do when they saw it, when they understood what Philippa's old falling-apart house in the middle of nowhere actually was. She had imagined various versions of this moment over the past weeks. The reality was quieter than her imagination. There was no dramatic recalibration, no visible shock. Just a slow, almost imperceptible shift in posture, the particular physical adjustment of people who have arrived expecting leverage and found instead that the ground is not quite where they thought. She went downstairs and opened the door before they knocked. "Stafford, Philippa, Callum." Her voice was pleasant, the voice she had spent 40 years perfecting in the service of other people's comfort. "Come in, I'll make tea." She showed them into the living room with its wide plank floors and its stone fireplace and its walls covered in photographs of herself, 60-some photographs of Dorothea Winslow, at every age and season of her adult life, looked after and displayed by a man who had spent 40 years being unable to say directly what he spent 40 years demonstrating in this room. She watched her stepchildren's eyes move across the photographs and come to rest each of them in turn on the understanding that they were looking at something they had not anticipated and could not immediately categorize. She made tea in the kitchen and carried it out on the tray she had found in the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one with the hand-painted New England scene on its surface, faded now, but still clear enough to see maples, a white church, a covered bridge. She set it on the table between them and poured 4 cups and sat down and crossed her hands in her lap and waited. Philippa spoke first, which Dorothea had expected. Philippa had always been the one to speak first. "We've come to discuss the property situation," she said, her voice carrying its practiced note of reasonable concern. "We think there's been a significant misunderstanding about what Father intended when he structured his estate. This property is clearly worth considerably more than anyone realized when the will was drawn." "Is it?" Dorothea said. "We've had it assessed." Stafford's voice now taking over with the authority of the person who considers himself to be running any given room. "Current market value of the land and structure combined puts it somewhere between $3 and $4 million. As Father's primary heirs, we believe we have a legitimate claim to a share of any significant asset, particularly one that was maintained in part through the resources of the marital estate." Dorothea picked up her tea. She drank from it. She set it down. "This property was deeded to me in June of 1984, she said, 3 months after your father and I were married. It was structured as an outright gift legally separate from our marriage. James Aldrich has the documentation. The court has the documentation. Your attorneys have the documentation. There is no legitimate claim. You know this." "We don't agree with that interpretation," Callum said. It was the first time he had spoken. He said it the way someone says something they have been told to say. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood. She walked to the door of Rex's study. She went inside. She stood for a moment in the quiet of that room, the filing cabinets, the desk, the banker's lamp, and she breathed once steadily, and then she took the folder from the third cabinet, the one labeled with their names, and she carried it back to the living room and set it on the coffee table between the tea tray and her stepchildren, setting it down with the same unhurried care she had used to set down the teacups. She sat back down. "Your father practiced law in this city for 50 years, she said. In that time, he accumulated a great deal of documentation about a great many people and situations. He kept it organized and current because he understood that information properly maintained is the most durable form of protection available." She looked at the folder on the table. "He left it all to me." No one spoke. "He never used any of it," she continued. "Using it would have been wrong, and your father, whatever his other failures, understood what was wrong. But he kept it. And he left it to me with instructions that I was to use it only if I needed to protect myself." She looked at Stafford, then at Philippa, then at Callum. "I need to protect myself." Stafford's jaw was tight. "You're bluffing." "Your father taught me," she said, "that people who bluff don't last 50 years at the top of this profession. He also taught me that the most effective legal strategies are the ones that never have to be executed." She paused. "I am offering you a very simple arrangement. You withdraw the court motion. You accept the will as written. You return to your lives and allow me to live mine. We need not see each other again or have any further communication. That is the entirety of my offer." Philippa's voice, when it came, had lost its practiced smoothness. "And if we don't, then on Monday morning, James Aldrich will contact the Internal Revenue Service on my behalf, and the Boston Globe will receive an anonymous package, and whatever the contents of this folder describe will become a matter of public record." She looked at the folder on the table. "I haven't read it. Your father asked me not to, and I respected that. But I know your father. I know how he worked. I know how thorough he was." She met Philippa's eyes. "You know how thorough he was." The room was very quiet. Outside, through the open window, the fountain ran. A breeze moved through the maple canopy, and the light shifted across the floor. And somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker worked at a dead tree with the steady, patient rhythm of something that has all the time in the world. Callum looked at his hands. Philippa looked at the folder. Stafford looked at the window, and she watched something move across his face, not defeatism, but the particular quality of recalculation that comes when a man realizes the room is different from the one he thought he entered. "We'll need to discuss this privately," he said. "Of course," Dorothea said. "Take all the time you need." She stood, which indicated that the time they needed would be spent elsewhere. "But understand something before you go. This house is mine. It was always meant to be mine. Your father loved you in the complicated ways that fathers love children who make loving them complicated. But he loved me differently. He just lacked the courage to demonstrate that publicly until he no longer had to worry about the cost of it." She looked at all three of them one final time. "He's not here to be courageous for anymore, so I'll do it for him." They left without another word. She stood on the portico and watched the Cadillac navigate the dirt road back toward the covered bridge, watched it until the sound of the engine was absorbed by the forest. And then she went inside and sat in Rex's leather chair in the study and looked at the filing cabinet and felt spreading slowly through her chest like the particular warmth of a fire that has just caught something she recognized after a moment as relief. Not triumph, not satisfaction in any sharp or vindictive sense. Relief. The relief of a woman who has been braced for impact for a very long time and has just been permitted to put her arms down. She picked up her phone and called James Aldrich. "It's done," she said. A pause. "I'm sorry. They'll withdraw the motion. Give them a few days, but it's done." Another pause longer. "Dot, what did you do?" "I had a conversation," she said. "Rex left me everything I needed to have it." The withdrawal arrived at James's office 5 days later on a Thursday. All parties, the document stated, had agreed to resolve their differences without further litigation, and the estate of Reginald Winslow was to be considered closed and final as written. James called her when it came through. She was in the garden, which is where she was most mornings now, working through the beds with a thoroughness that was becoming its own form of daily devotion. She listened to him read the key language and said thank you and put the phone back in her pocket and went on with what she had been doing. The news about the Brookline house came in pieces over the following months, filtering through to her via James, via Bernie, via the particular way that information moves through the peripheral networks of people who know people. The house had been listed in August at a price that reflected its neighborhood rather than its encumbrances. By September, it had sat unsold, the historic preservation requirements sending buyers away, and the mortgage revelation sending others. By October, the price had been reduced. By December, 9 months after Rex's death, it sold to a preservation society at a price that, once the mortgage was satisfied and the legal fees paid and the commission taken, left Stafford and Philippa and Callum each with a figure that was a fraction of what they had arranged their expectations around. The trust funds proved as Rex had designed them to be exactly as accessible as he had intended, which was to say not very. Stafford's first annual character evaluation, administered in October by the retired Judge Rex, had appointed produced an assessment that Stafford's attorneys contested, and the trust documents clearly anticipated being contested and provided no mechanism for contesting. Philippa's trust administrator determined by November that 3 divorces and 2 adult children who did not speak to their mother did not constitute the stable family relationships the document required. Callum's first quarterly investment report, due in September, was filed late incorrectly, and in a format the trust documents specified was insufficient. The automatic transfer protocols began their work quietly and without drama. Rex had not punished them. He had simply designed a reality in which their own natures would punish them, and then he had stepped back and let it operate. By October, Dorothea had been in Clearwater Falls for 5 months. She knew the town now the way you know a place you have decided to belong to, not the comprehensive knowledge of someone who has been there forever, but the specific growing knowledge of someone who has chosen it, which is a different and in some ways more deliberate form of knowing. She knew which floorboard in the library entrance creaked and where Freddie Oakes kept the book she was recommending this month, and which pew in Pastor Ellsworth's church had a particularly clear view of the autumn light through the east window. She volunteered at the library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, shelving returns and helping with the children's reading program that Freddie had started the previous year, and which needed, as Freddie put it, someone who could read aloud without self-consciousness. Dorothea could read aloud without self-consciousness. 40 years of hosting dinner parties had given her, whatever else it had taken, a complete comfort with being heard in a room. On Wednesday afternoons, she helped at the community center, a converted barn at the edge of town, where a rotating cast of Clearwater Falls residents ran programs that the town's small budget would not otherwise support. She taught a weekly workshop on kitchen gardening that had started with 4 attendees and grown by October to 14. Mostly women, mostly her age or older women, who had the knowledge already and needed, she understood, less instruction than permission. On Sunday mornings, she sat in the third pew from the back of the Congregational Church, the same pew Rex had sat in for 40 years, and listened to Pastor Ellsworth and felt the particular quality of being in a place that had been holding space for her long before she arrived. She had friends. Real ones, the kind that arise from repeated, unperformed contact, from knowing what someone takes in their coffee and how their face looks when they're worried and what they find funny without trying to. Bernie first and most, Bernie, who had been waiting at the end of the dirt road with a basket of food on the day everything changed, and who had not required Dorothea to be anything other than exactly what she was. Freddie, who was 34 and had grown up in Clearwater Falls and knew its history the way librarians know the history of places, completely idiosyncratically, with an affection that does not require the place to be larger than it is. Pastor Ellsworth's wife, Marion, who grew dahlias and had opinions about them. She had, for the first time in her adult life, a life that was entirely hers, not assembled around someone else's requirements, not performed for someone else's social landscape, not maintained at the cost of her own visibility. Just hers, its pleasures and its rhythms and its daily decisions, all belonging to her in a way that 40 years of marriage to a powerful man in a large house in a city that recognized him everywhere they went had never quite permitted. She had not known she was hungry for this. You don't know what you've been starved of until you're fed. She found the second envelope on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of October. She had been organizing Rex's study, not erasing it exactly, but making room within it for herself, moving some of his books to make space for hers, replacing a few of the framed legal citations on the walls with photographs she had chosen, small adjustments, toward the person who actually lived here now. She had been working her way through the desk drawers, sorting and filing, when she found it in the very back of the bottom drawer, tucked behind a folder of property tax receipts from the 90s. A cream envelope sealed with her name on the outside in Rex's handwriting. Below her name in smaller letters for Dot's future. Open when you're ready. She sat down in the leather chair and looked at it for a while. Then she opened it. Inside was a property deed, 20 acres of land on the western edge of Clearwater Falls, fronting Maplewood Road, with a small barn and a 2-room cottage currently used for storage. The deed was in her name, had been in her name since 2018, and was accompanied by a paid tax receipt through 2034 and a structural assessment from a local contractor describing both buildings as sound and suitable for renovation. With it was a trust document, $500,000 in an account at a Vermont bank held in the name of the Dorothea Claire Winslow Future Fund, with a single condition attached, that the funds be used for whatever purposes Dorothea Claire Winslow chose to pursue. No other conditions, no reporting requirements, no character evaluations, no annual reviews. Her money, her decision, her life. And a note, 1 page this time, in Rex's handwriting. He had written it, the date at the top indicated in March of 2023, 1 year before he died. He had known she understood, had known in the way of men who have spent their lives reading documents about mortality and planning around it, that the time was getting shorter, that the arrangements needed to be complete. Dot. If you're reading this, you found the sanctuary and you found your way through whatever came after it, and you're ready for what comes next. I know you're ready because the woman I spent 40 years watching build things, gardens, dinners, lives that weren't technically hers, is not a woman who stops when she's given the chance to start. The 20 acres are yours. The barn needs work, but the bones are good. You'll see that immediately. The cottage could be anything. The land is flat and south-facing, and the soil is what you'd expect from Vermont, which is to say difficult and rewarding and worth the effort. I have a suggestion, but it is only a suggestion, and you are to ignore it entirely if it doesn't match what you want. Build something for women like you. Women who gave their best years in service of someone else's life and arrived at a certain age with nothing in their own names and nowhere that was entirely theirs. Build them a place to land, a place to think, a place to be seen by people who are actually looking. You know what that place needs to feel like because you spent 40 years needing it. That's the only qualification that matters. I love you, Dot. I loved you from the first morning you brought that coffee upstairs. I loved you every morning after that. I should have said so more. I'm saying it now, you're Rex. She read it 3 times. Then she sat for a long time in the leather chair in the study that had been Rex's and was now partly hers, looking out the window at the garden she had been restoring for 5 months, the roses and the stone paths and the fountain that ran again, and she thought about what it means to be seen, not performed for, not accommodated, not tolerated. Seeing the actual, specific, irreplaceable person you are in your ordinary moments doing ordinary things. Wanting ordinary things that turn out, when you finally have them, not to be ordinary at all. She got up. She found a yellow legal pad in the desk drawer, Rex's brand, the kind he had used his entire career, and she sat back down and she began to write. Not a grocery list, not a dinner party timeline, not a card for someone else's birthday or a note ensuring someone else's comfort. She wrote a plan. Her plan for her land in her handwriting on her yellow legal pad, in the house that had been built for her and waited for her and was hers now fully and finally and without condition. She called it Winslow House, a place for women who needed one, a retreat, a landing point, a space where the primary project was not service but recovery, where the question was not, what can you do for someone else, but who are you when no one is asking you for anything? She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she finally set the pen down and looked at what she had, it was not a finished plan. It was better than a finished plan. It was a beginning, which is the only honest form a plan can take. She called James Aldrich. I need to discuss a project, as she said. He listened while she described it. When she finished, there was a pause. Rex would have loved this, James said. I know, she said. I think he planned on it. November came to Clearwater Falls with the particular ferocity of New England autumn, the maples going from green to red to gold to bare in the space of 3 weeks, the air sharpening into something that smelled of wood smoke and cold earth, and the very particular quality of light that belongs to the last warm days before winter makes its position clear. Dorothea sat on the stone portico of the sanctuary on a Saturday morning in mid-November, 6 months after she had first driven up the dirt road with 3 suitcases and 2 boxes and a rusty iron key and nothing else she could claim as her own. She had her coffee made by her for herself in her kitchen, carried to her porch in a mug she had chosen at a shop in Montpelier because she liked the weight of it in her hands. The fountain ran in the garden below. The rose beds were cut back for winter, tidy and expectant, waiting for spring. The stone paths were clear. Bernie sat in the other porch chair, her own mug in her hands, talking about something that had happened at the general store, involving a delivery truck and a miscommunication about a cheese order that had somehow resulted in 40 pounds of aged cheddar that no one had requested. Dorothea listened and laughed and felt the laugh come from somewhere genuine, somewhere she had not had reliable access to for a very long time. On the 20 acres across the road, the contractor she had hired in October had begun the preliminary work. The barn's foundation had been assessed and shored. The cottage had been cleared of decades of stored equipment and opened to the light. She had walked the land twice in October and once in early November, learning its slopes and its drainage and the way the afternoon sun moved across it, the same patient attending she had given the garden here, getting to know a place before asking anything of it. Winslow House was not yet built. It was still mostly intention and yellow legal pad pages and conversations with James about the trust structure and conversations with a woman in Burlington who ran a similar program and had agreed to advise in one very long conversation with Freddie Oakes, who turned out to have ideas about what a library within such a place might look like that were worth several hours of serious discussion. But it was coming. She could feel it coming the way you feel a season turning, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of smaller changes, each one unremarkable alone together, making something undeniable. Her phone rang. James. It's finalized, he said. His voice carried a quality she had not heard in it before, a lightness as though something heavy had been put down. The estate is closed. All challenges resolved. The sanctuary and all associated properties are yours, Dorothea, completely, permanently, with no remaining legal ambiguity of any kind. She looked at the garden, the bare rose canes, the clear stone paths, the fountain. They always were, she said. Rex just made sure the world caught up with the truth of it. A small pause. He was a complicated man. He was, she said, But his love wasn't complicated. That was the one thing about him that was completely clear. She hung up and put the phone in her pocket and picked up her coffee and sat for a while in the November morning. Bernie still talking about the cheese, 40 pounds of aged cheddar, and no one to blame. And wasn't that just the nature of things sometimes? And the fountain running in the garden and the bare maples standing at the edge of the clearing, in the manner of things that have survived many winters and expect to survive many more. Dorothea Winslow was 67 years old. She had spent 4 decades being invisible, not by nature, not by preference, but by the slow accumulation of a life that had never quite made room for the person she actually was. She had been a wife and a hostess and a gardener and a presence in rooms where other people were the point. She had made things beautiful and then watched other people claim the beauty. She had loved carefully and faithfully and without adequate return, and she had done it so long and so quietly that she had half convinced herself it was enough. It had not been enough, but it had been preparation. Every garden she had grown, every room she had made habitable, every silent swallowing of the things she actually wanted to say, all of it had been without her knowing the practice for this. For the woman who could stand in a room of 3 people, who had spent 40 years underestimating her, and place a folder on a coffee table, and mean every word she said. For the woman who could drive 3 hours north to an unknown address with 3 suitcases and 2 boxes, and find at the end of a dirt road not an ending, but the beginning she had been owed for years. For the woman sitting on this porch, in this house, in this life, fully, finally, irrevocably hers. She finished her coffee. She set the mug down on the stone beside the chair. "Bernie," she said. Bernie paused mid-sentence about the cheddar. "Yes. Tell me about the land on the south side of Maplewood." "Mom, the drainage patterns in spring. I want to understand what we're working with before the ground freezes." Bernie looked at her for a moment with the expression she wore when something pleased her in a way that exceeded ordinary pleasure. Then she set down her own mug and began to talk, and Dorothea listened, and the morning went on around them, the fountain and the bare maples and the November light, and the 20 acres across the road waiting to become something that would shelter women who needed sheltering, built by a woman who finally, at 67 years old, understood exactly what shelter was worth. She was just beginning, and this time she knew it.